Hey, 42 here. The small British Crown dependency of the Isle of Man is famous for many things. The Manx cat with no tail, TT motorbike races, and smoked herring kippers. But in the early 1930s, the island briefly became famous for a small undead mammal called Jeff. And to this day, residents still scream in terror if you mention the name of Jeff the Talking Mongoose.
Hey.
Well, okay, maybe they don't scream. They probably just roll their eyes, tut, and say, "Get out of my kipper shop." Nonetheless, Jeff the Mongoose captured the imagination of the tabloid press. He ended up in law books, tarnished reputations, got people fired, inspired lawsuits, wasted the time of several esteemed academics, and was instrumental in the BBC overhauling their staff policies. But to find out who Jeff the Mongoose was and why he was undead, we need to go back to September of 1931, when the Irving family started hearing scratching, barking, growling, spitting, and blowing noises coming from the rafters and skirting boards of their cosy family farmhouse at Cashan's Gap on the Isle of Man. Everyone knows Raid Shadow Legends by now, but did you know it's Raid's second anniversary? That's right, it's been 2 years since Raid burst onto the scene and completely took over mobile gaming. And since then, Raid's only gotten bigger and only gotten better. For me, it's when I'm traveling and I have free time to kill. You can literally play from anywhere, and yes, that includes on the toilet. I'd definitely be Crusader from the Sacred Order. I mean, who wouldn't want to be a medieval knight with a massive sword? What I like best about the game is the campaign mode. With constant quest updates and a huge variety of locations, there's always something new and exciting around every corner. I've found the trick is learning when to use your most powerful abilities and when to save them for a trickier opponent. As I mentioned earlier, this month is Raid's 2-year anniversary. They've got 6 straight weeks of anniversary events and tournaments running from the 1st of March all the way to the middle of April. All of them with insane prizes to win. If you haven't joined the Raid community already, then what are you waiting for? Raid is huge. It's only getting bigger and better. So if you're looking to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is click the link in the description or scan my QR code. And if you're a new player, you'll get a free epic champion, Jotun, who is amazing for the Doom Tower, by the way. You'll also get 100k silver, 50 gems, and the free ancient shards, so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. But be quick, because these rewards will only be available for the next 30 days. Once you're in, you can find me in-game under the name 42, and if you're fast enough, you can join my clan. Good luck, and I'll see you in-game. Farmer James Irving, his wife Margaret, and their 13-year-old daughter, Vara, were really starting to lose sleep over the ghostly noises. So James took the only logical step he could to deal with the sounds. He tried to poison it, trap it, and shoot it with a rifle, whatever it was. Believe it or not, none of these methods worked. So James attempted a variety of animal and bird noises to see if the voice would respond. Amazingly, it not only responded, but mimicked each call perfectly. Vara tried the same thing with songs and nursery rhymes, and their mysterious guest happily performed them all for her, in a voice which was apparently 2 octaves above the normal human range. One night, however, Jeff decided to introduce himself properly, and from that point on, the Irvings couldn't shut the skinny little bastard up. He revealed he was a ghost who'd taken the form of a mongoose. Then, the supernatural mongoose declared he was 80 years old and was born in New Delhi in 1852. That's right, the furry bugger had somehow travelled 7,000 miles, as the mongoose flies, to live inside the walls of a remote farmhouse on the Isle of Man. When the family quizzed him on how he was able to talk, he said he was an extra clever mongoose. So he obviously wasn't the most modest of carnivorous mammals, Mind you, he didn't seem to be too confident about his looks either. "I am a freak," he told the Irvings.
If you saw me, you'd faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into stone or a pillar of salt.
By this point, James was feeling a little guilty about trying to shoot and poison Jeff. After all, he seemed like a fairly decent critter. So he apologised, and from that point on, they were best of friends. Jeff guarded the house, would chase away mice, extinguished a stove if the Irvings forgot, wake them up if they overslept, and deliver rabbits as gifts for the family, which Jeff proudly pointed out that he'd strangled to death. Which is nice, I suppose. I usually prefer my stew ingredients not strangled to death, but hey, it's the thought that counts. As for the Irvings, they were happy to repay the favour. They filled a saucer with bacon, sausages, bananas, and chocolate, which are obviously a mongoose's favourite food groups, and suspended it from the ceiling, so Jeff could help himself when no one was watching. Which is important when you're a self-conscious supernatural talking mongoose. They even took him for walks to the market, during which Jeff would talk incessantly about any subject that took his fancy. Although he always, conveniently, made sure he was completely obscured by a hedge, just in case anyone caught a peek of his hideous features. Now, by this point, I completely understand if you're thinking, 42 is really out of ideas. He's just started making up bollocks about a talking mongoose. But I'd like to clarify, I'm not making any of this up. The Irvings definitely were, but I'm not. It was only a matter of time until a swarm of tabloid journalists were heading to the Isle of Man, hoping for the merest glimpse of the creature, or at best a full warts and all interview featuring some of Jeff's kiss and tell secrets, and maybe even a full colour centerfold in skimpy mongoose lingerie. Mind you, a newspaper interview of Jeff would have to carry a parental advisory warning. He was rather prone to mood swings, you see, and could go from charming, sophisticated mongoose about town to the kind of mongoose who'd stick a broken glass in your face whilst looking at his girlfriend. And, by Irving family accounts, Jeff's conversation were littered with more F and C words than your average Tarantino film. In fact, his comments to Vrora were so unpleasant that James and Margaret had to move her bed into their room until Jeff learned to be a little less filthy. As ridiculous as all of this sounds, some residents of the Isle of Man really did believe there was something strange in the neighbourhood. So they decided to call Harry Price, paranormal investigator, mainly because none of the real Ghostbusters would be born for another few decades. Mind you, Price was very much the Peter Venkman of his day, having worked on a number of high-profile cases, such as his celebrated investigation into the haunted tourist kiosk at the top of the Eiffel Tower. Things kept going missing, you see. Souvenirs, keepsakes, cheap jewellery. So it was clearly the work of a malevolent spirit, or a shoplifter, or perhaps a malevolent spirit who enjoyed a bit of shoplifting. Long story short, Price was well experienced at investigating so-called supernatural occurrences that were most likely complete and utter bollocks. Before Price arrived on the scene, he asked James Irving for more information about Jeff. So he sent him his diary, still available today in the University of London archives. It goes into detail about how Jeff had a great facility for foreign languages. He suddenly started speaking Russian one day, wasn't too shabby at Arabic, understood sign language, could recite 4 lines of a Welsh poem, and sing 2 verses of a Spanish song. He also seemed to be the James Bond of the mongoose world. When not annoying the piss out of the Irvings with songs from around the world in falsetto, he ventured outside to spy on other farms, collect gossip from the locals, and reported his findings back to the family. The Irvings thought this was terrific, of course. So imagine their joy when Jeff suddenly developed psychic powers and could tell them what was going on 10 miles away without leaving the comfort of his skirting board. Now, these stories were obviously completely and utterly ludicrous. So, Harry Price decided not to waste his time any further and immediately booked himself a ticket to the Isle of Man. He informed the Irvings that he was on the way, but barely had time to dust off his proton pack before a letter arrived, saying that Jeff, by a massive coincidence, had suddenly gone missing. Honestly, you just couldn't make it up. Well, actually, you could, because they did. Nonetheless, a month later, in July 1935, Price decided to pack his PKE meter regardless and headed to the Isle of Man to see this mongoose in the ghostly flesh for himself. He asked his friend, Richard Lambert, an editor at the BBC, to come along as a witness. You can hardly blame him. If there was so much as a fleeting chance I was going to see an apparition of a talking mongoose, I'd want a bloody witness too. Unfortunately, when they arrived, Jeff still wasn't in a talking mood. So James gave them a tour of the house instead. He showed them cracks and peepholes in the walls, from where Jeff would mutter rude and embarrassing things. And here is where the story begins to unravel. You see, for a few years, newspapers and a few locals had speculated the entire phenomenon was down to Vwara, and she was able to produce Jeff's voice due to a hidden natural talent for ventriloquism. Sure enough, Price's big smoking gun in the case was realizing the space between the exterior stone walls and interior wooden walls acted as a huge microphone, and if he spoke into the cracks between the paneling, his voice would reverberate through the walls and be carried to every room in the house. Needless to say, Price and Lambert were both pretty unimpressed with the evidence, and the fact Jeff suddenly returned to Cashin's Gap on the night they left did nothing to appease their suspicions. Apparently, Jeff told James that he disliked Price because he had his doubting cap on. But even so, the magnanimous mongoose decided to make plasticine impressions of his own paws and teeth to prove his existence once and for all. And Price, in turn, did what any of us would do with evidence of a non-existent mongoose ghost. He sent it to one of Britain's most distinguished zoologists, Reginald Pocock, at the Natural History Museum. We can only imagine what Pocock thought when these items showed up, probably whatever the 1930s equivalent of WTF was. He spent very little time determining the teeth marks and paw prints had most likely come from a dog. Specifically, a sheepdog, and even more specifically, a sheepdog called Mona, who just so happened to be owned by the Irvings. I'm sure it was just a coincidence. Jeff wasn't going to take such flagrant denial lying down, or whatever mongooses do. He told the Irvings he'd plucked a hair from his own back and placed it inside an ornament upon the mantelpiece. Sure enough, there it was. And James forwarded it to Sir Julian Huxley, an esteemed evolutionary biologist, first director of UNESCO, and eugenicist. Huxley had more important things to do than examining the supposed hair of an undead mongoose. Like, deciding who was too stupid to pass on their genes. Yeah. And so he forwarded the sample to naturalist Francis Duncan Smith. After a quick comparison with hairs of various species, Duncan declared, with confidence, that the specimen could not have come from a mongoose, and was most likely from a long-haired dog. That's right, Mona again, the Irvings' suspect sheepdog. Mona spent so much time pretending to be a mongoose, she probably forgot she was a dog. In 1936, Price and Lambert published a full account of their findings in the book The Haunting of Cashin's Gap. Although they never explicitly denied the existence of Jeff, the evidence they laid out was pretty damning, and ultimately left the whole Vwara being a two-bit ventriloquist mumbling expletives at herself into the walls theory the most likely. After James died in 1945, Margaret and Vwara were forced to sell the farm at a very low price, because For some reason, people weren't keen to buy a farmhouse haunted by a foul-mouthed mongoose. I don't know about you, but I think I'd be the first through the doors of the estate agents for that one. It was eventually purchased by actor Leslie Graham, who later sold a story to the press, claiming he'd shot and killed poor Jeff. He even provided a body. But Voira shot his story down in flames, saying that it was most certainly not Jeff, being both the wrong size and colour to be their famous family phantasm, which must have infuriated Graham, as it's thought he only claimed to be Jeff's murderer in order to end all the urban legends associated with his new home. Voira, however, was having none of it. During an interview in later life, she still maintained Jeff was real and was dogmatic in her belief all the way up to her death in 2005. So, was Jeff simply a product of Voira's imagination? Well, yes, probably. But can we blame her? After all, she was living in a really isolated farmhouse on a really isolated island with very, very little contact with the outside world. 70 years before the invention of Netflix, Zoom, and Disney+. In the end, it was probably just a case of her making her own entertainment. But what really happened at Cashin's Gap in the 1930s? I guess we'll never truly know. Thanks for watching. Thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check it out using the link below.